Helpers. Today we continue our emotion tour. So we've done shame, disgust, and now we have made it to Kibby's favorite emotion to experience, which is, you guessed it, guilt. Guilt is interesting because my focus is heavily on shame, and guilt in some ways is the other side of shame. People confuse them all the time. They can be confused about actually which emotion it is they're even experiencing, and I think sometimes you can have a bit of like a guilt and shame soup going on. What differentiates them, though, is that when you feel ashamed, you typically feel like you are a bad person, you're worthless, you're devalued. It's just this like awful, painful emotion. Guilt actually allows you to look at the behavior itself and say, okay, well, I'm an intact person, but this thing that I did, I don't really like it. It went against some value of mine, some moral of mine, and I feel bad about it. And typically when people feel guilt, instead of like wanting to run away or hide or get angry at another person, they really want to repair. And so they'll apologize or confess or somehow make reparations. Guilt is sometimes seen as the more adaptive emotion. If you think of shame as often maladaptive, some people make that argument. The guilt it's kind of like if you had a break with somebody, like if they're upset with you, if instead of feeling shame, you could feel guilt, there might be better outcomes because you might actually try to repair the fissure that occurred. But sometimes guilt can get to a point where it's chronic, you're just feeling it kind of at the drop of the hat, or you're feeling it in a lot of situations where it's really not justified. And that might be because of how you were raised. You might be, an excessive people pleaser, or you might be Kibby. So Kibby, what is this emotion like for you?
Well, I do want to add that that guilt shame soup, we can make a whole new emotion called shilt.
Oh,
so you're here, folks. You could be feeling shilt. Or game doesn't really work, but you know what I mean. So shilt, but guilt. That's a fun emotion. When I feel a lot, as you said, and I feel guilty right now. Yeah, anyway. So yeah, as you mentioned, guilt is that emotion you feel when you think you've done something wrong, something against your own morals or principles. And what's cool about what you're describing is that guilt and shame are called social emotions. When people feel guilt, they actually have activation in parts of the brain that involve calling up memories to figure out how to make decisions, right? Like what's going to lead to good outcomes based on your own experiences. But guilt also activates the areas involved in theory of mind, perspective taking, or other kind of social reflection. So they really see how guilt applies to social relationships. And if you think about it, shame and guilt are both emotions that involved in like reflecting on yourself and learning how to be better in your relationships and how to repair problems and avoid rejection. So this is one of our favorite emotions in terms of our our loved ones podcast.
Yeah, another thing is actually guilt. So I've been studying shame in BPD, and we find that shame is really associated with in all sorts of ways. But the worst outcomes are actually people who are high in shame and low in guilt. So again, you see like guilt can come in and save the day by actually helping you repair your relationships. And if you're low in guilt, then you've got a problem. But if you're high in guilt too, that could be, there's so many different things could be going on. I think one important area is when maybe somebody in your life is anxious and is easily upset or distressed, and you, in reaction to that, can feel a lot of guilt for like setting boundaries or doing things independently that might cause them to feel distress. And that's just one area I know I've experienced of a lot of guilt comes in, and it can be hard to know, like, am I doing something wrong, or is this just in reaction to another person?
Yeah. No, it's really interesting thinking about guilt and doing this research in preparation for this episode, because it's really about what's your relationship with responsibility and control over things in your life, right? So when guilt is really helpful because it has this like active part of it, like, oh, I messed up, I'm going to be able to fix it, versus shame, which is like, I'm just a bad person, there's nothing I can do. So it does have that adaptive part of like taking control and accountability of your life and mistakes. But it can be pathological and problematic if you're taking responsibility for stuff that you have no business taking control over, right? Like someone's mental health, right? Or losses, or, you know, just other things in the environment or your life that you don't really have control over, but you can't wrap your head around how much control you do have. So that's when really the guilt record skips, is like not knowing how much control you actually have over things that are bad in your environment.
Mm-hmm. I think upbringing can really play into this as well. I mean, I've just had multiple patients with, like, I think of mothers who would expect their kid to be like a reflection of themselves to such a degree where when they didn't match up, it was just this immensely guilting experience. And so I can imagine some of our followers have maybe felt that way. Like, oh, I was always expected to do what my mom wanted, my dad wanted. And there wasn't much of acceptance of my own individuality. And so it was always met with guilting. Yeah. That's really interesting. Yeah. The idea that you're doing something wrong just by, you know, acting in different ways or choosing a different life. My boyfriend Alex and I have talked about how he's like the guilt monster. I mean, if you think I have a lot of guilt, he feels guilty all the time. And we talked about how he was raised both Catholic and Jewish. So just his background is like the two religions that have a lot of guilt, especially passed down from, I don't know, the mother. But yeah, it's like, you know, even sometimes it's a big part of religion to, I don't say encourage guilt, but at least get people in touch with their guilt for like the original sin or whatever form of belief. So it really encourages people to keep fixing things, right? To keep working and trying harder. It makes sense. It's a bit of a shortcut. Yeah. Because those action urges are good, but the feeling can suck.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I often, it's funny, I went to an OCD workshop, and we'll talk about the relevance to mental health in a minute, but I went to an OCD workshop, and the clinician talked about how people with OCD tend to feel a lot of guilt. And they always describe that feeling of guilt in their sternum, in their chest. So that kind of feeling of like, you know, like this kind of pain in your chest of like, oh no, I screwed up. And I definitely feel that a lot.
So you feel guilty primarily about work, or are there other areas where this comes up?
Yeah, that's a good point. I didn't really think, you know, I was doing so much reading the literature, I didn't really look into myself with this guilt. But I think one thing that jumps out is there were times when my mom, when she was struggling with her alcoholism or just, you know, in pain in general, she was very angry about her divorce from my dad and just angry about a lot of things. And she was sometimes in the moment, in, you know, really dark moments, kind of put it on me, like, I'm drinking because of you, or I'm drinking because you went to your dad's house, or you left to go to college, right? So there was just a lot of this like blame and putting the responsibility on me, which, as we said, was like inappropriate and didn't really make any sense. So even though in my head I was like, no, I get that's not my fault.
Yeah.
I still had to be reassured that this wasn't my fault, that my mom's illness wasn't my fault. So, and it's really hard because I'm sure there's some things that I did, like going to my dad's house when things were hard or whatever, that did like prompt my mom to drink more. But that's not the same as like being responsible for her alcoholism. So that's where the guilt is really dysfunctional for me. It's like, how much control do I have over mental illness? And here I am as a therapist taking as much control as I possibly can. So, you know.
I think it would be, I wonder if there have been any studies looking at whether children of divorce have higher rates of guilt than other children. I mean, because it's such a pervasive belief, you know, that this is my fault or I've somehow contributed to this. And as you're saying, I mean, even though none of that was your fault, she probably did drink in response to like seeing your relationship with your dad. And it's just so hard as a kid to know how to parse that out. Like, okay, those are her feelings and she's responsible for them. I have to keep living my life, even if it means doing things that are going to hurt her.
Yeah, I think that, I don't know about the research, but I see this clinically all the time where patients get some kind of messaging when they're a kid of, that they're somehow responsible for problems in, their relationship with their parents or things in the home. And that, I'm guessing it's because the parents didn't explain what was happening. And when kids don't know anything, they assume their parents are all powerful. So if they're not doing the wrong thing because they're the gods of their life, then I'm doing the wrong thing because I'm the kid and I know I do wrong things, right? And so that's I know, but you hear that all the time, don't you, clinically, where they're like, yeah, my dad was not connected to me or didn't seem to care about me, and it's probably something I did wrong, right? It's not, they don't think, well, he probably has like a mental issue, a depression that leads him to being not so connected. They really internalize it, whether it goes into shame of your beliefs about yourself or guilt, the things that you have done or did not do, right?
I think it's especially tough too because kids, they do add stress to the family life, and so parents might be fighting over things like parenting, but that's a parent problem, not a kid problem.
Exactly.
But it's just internalized anyway. Yeah. So
in looking at this, it was like, I can imagine from my own experience how guilt can be problematic. And I know it's funny because I know that you and I have, when you were doing your master's on shame, we went back and forth about like, is shame helpful? Is guilt helpful? And I was like, no, guilt's not helpful because I just feel that it just weighs me down. But, I found some research that backed me up and so that actually is related to mental health issues. And it's interesting too, the research shows that if people have really large amounts of guilt, it actually does mimic symptoms of disorders, even if they don't have the disorder. So a lot of guilt could actually lead to a lot of mental health issues. So the first one is the most obvious is OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. There's actually a subtype of OCD that we talked about before in the OCD episode called like the scrupulosity subtype. I don't think we've said those words, but people who make prayers or pacts with God where they think they did something wrong or they've sinned or they've, something that they did wrong, and then they just do obsessive, usually like religious rituals like prayer and I think you did that too, right? Didn't you have like some plain...
Yeah, it's not, well, I guess it might be related to guilt. Basically it's just, I don't want to die in a plane crash. And even though I'm an atheist, and I still do this a lot, like say a very specific prayer to both God and the goddess that I made up when I was 9. And the idea was basically like, I just noticed when I was on airplanes that I would have this feeling like if I am not feeling anxious and vigilant the entire time, then like I'll be punished by the plane going down. Like I need to almost fill up this cup of punishment so that I won't be punished in some other way.
Yeah. You might have not felt the emotion of guilt, but that's still the same kind of idea of I can do something about it, right? If I just, if I pray or if I didn't pray, that actually has implication for if this plane's going to make it, right? So it's this kind of a sense of responsibility that in OCD is like really, it's really there a lot of the time, right? And also there's guilt in other parts of OCD, like magical thinking, where a lot of OCD can be like, oh, if I didn't check the stove, my house will blow up. If this happens, my mother will die, right? This kind of these, really catastrophic thoughts, but sometimes they have a feeling of responsibility, like I did this, like I got to check the stove. Or they sometimes worry that even if they have that thought that caused it, like, oh no, I thought about that. Now, if she does die, it's my fault. So this kind of magical thinking of that your thoughts become real. Yeah. That has a lot of guilt involved in it. So,
Yeah, a lot of OCD obsessions around am I the kind of person who hurts others? Like did I hit somebody with my car on the way home? Am I a pedophile? Am I, like, would I do something that's really terrible? And now I have to think about it constantly and do compulsions in order to make sure this isn't the case. But what if this is the case? Like, how could I possibly live in society and I'm going to hurt people and it's going to be terrible? So, yeah, it's very common.
Yeah, it's kind of like with the dysfunction there is not necessarily the feeling of guilt in repairing it, but then the feeling of repairing doesn't work, right? Like if I'm nervous that my hands are dirty with COVID, I wash it, but I don't get the sense of, oh, okay, phew, did it, wash my hands. Then you're going to keep doing it over and over. So that's where the compulsions of like fixing over and over and over.
And it's because of this key point, right? That guilt is adaptive if there is something you can do about it that will actually lead to change. But if you can't change something, like you can't really control whether you get COVID. I mean, you can do things that will lower the probability, but just by washing your hands, you haven't made like a meaningful, well, I shouldn't say meaningful. You just can't know, like, did I just prevent myself from getting COVID and then passing it to other people? All you know is that you wash your hands. So there's just this huge element that's out of your control and the guilt remains.
Yeah. So OCD is a big guilt disorder. The other ones I looked at are, it's like thinking about if people have an inappropriate amount of guilt or sense of responsibility over bad things that happen in their life. And major depressive disorder, one of the diagnostic criteria is, do you have inappropriate guilt, right? They do show that people who in depression, who they have, if they report higher levels of guilt, they have more depression. And also in post-traumatic stress disorder and prolonged grief. So people who have had some kind of trauma, they lost something, they saw someone die, they've always got hurt themselves, or prolonged grief is someone who, has lost somebody in their life, like complicated grief. And they feel the sense of responsibility, guilt over what happened, right? An example I was thinking of is before this episode is I was thinking about this woman who lost their mother to sickness, and then just fixating on the different things like she could have done differently, or the doctors could have done differently to like help her in the final stages. And it seems to me like this inappropriate amount of responsibility, which is something you want when something traumatic happens, right? If there's a sexual assault or a death or something horrific, we have a hard time saying to ourselves, like, just sometimes the universe throws us this shit, right? Sometimes bad things happen even though we did everything right. We want to look for ways to predict and control bad things, right? So it's like, if I had done this differently, that person wouldn't have died. If I had said this thing. And so you're constantly going over almost like your sense of control over an uncontrollable tragedy.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much around death and grief that it's just like ripe for this. I mean, you see this like when people commit suicide. What could I have done differently? Should I have known? What should I could I have prevented it? With do not resuscitate orders, I think are huge in complicated grief. Like, was I right to sign that paper?
Gosh,
I don't know.
Imagine.
Yeah, when a doctor says like these are the options and there's a % chance that both of them won't work, which one do you pick? I mean, these are just like setups for this chronic guilt. And so, it's the job of the therapist, I suppose, is to try to help that patient understand that they did their best and that there was no way of controlling this outcome. And
that's the really hard part. I know that you've had experience with treating grief. I haven't had like formal experience, but of course I've done that before. But with trauma, that's the part that people have a really hard time letting go of, is their guilt. Because then they're like, what? The answer is that there's nothing I could have done to prevent my rape. And I was like, kind of, yeah. I mean, I hate to say that, but it's just, like bad things happen even when people do things absolutely perfectly. And the reality is that we're not in control of a lot of things.
Yeah.
And that is not a pill that people swallow very well. They're like, no. Then how can I prevent things in the future?
Right.
So I understand why people have a hard time letting go of their guilt.
Absolutely. I think another thing that comes in is when you have competing values, and So, like, for instance, with complicated grief, if you have somebody in the hospital for a very long time and you feel like, let's say your father is dying in the hospital, you feel the need to be there constantly, but you also have children to take care of, you know, you have a partner to be with, you have a job. And so it just becomes this massive guilt where it's like, who am I disappointing today?
Yeah, and especially when we're in a society of that encourages us to do everything perfectly all the time, right? It's like, it's just not possible, and we don't see that as a limitation, you know, just a natural limitation of our capacities, but it's like it's something that we did wrong, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, it's like this perfectionism can drive a lot of guilt.
Yeah, so I mean, I think what we're seeing, you know, through this talk about grief and trauma is that guilt can really make this grief more intense, and it can make grief symptoms last longer. And this can wind up having, you know, being something like complicated grief or prolonged grief disorder. And it's just so sad because, as Kibby was saying, like, this is an attempt to know that in the future these things won't repeat. It's not just left up to chance, but in actuality, by holding on to that belief, you're prolonging your own symptoms. So I think if you notice that you or your loved one is experiencing this propensity to kind of ruminate on guilt, then this is actually something that really should be intervened on.
Yeah.
And so, Kibby, what would you say about, I mean, how this interferes with relationships?
Yeah, because it's such a social emotion, it's interesting to think about how it can interfere with loved ones. I mean, you tell me how my guilt has interfered with our relationship. But one thing I've noticed with people with perfectionism, or, you know, just a lot of guilt, is that they need they excessively fixate over the thing they did wrong, right? I see this a little bit more in social anxiety, actually. So maybe I'm thinking there, but people who like replay, you know, the conversation or the interaction, and they're like, oh, I said this wrong. They might have taken it wrong. And so they're kind of thinking about this over and over, or just like obsessively thinking about it in ways that actually block effective problem solving. So just like anxiety is to worry, I think excessive guilt could also lead to this worry that needs to think about what you did wrong without the productive thinking of like, okay, what can I do about it? What do I need to fix? Is it something I did wrong? Right? Like, what, really taking active steps towards it instead of just flipping it over in their minds over and over.
Yeah. So yeah, this reassurance seeking comes up all the time. I think this is especially, it's interesting when we think about attachment styles and how and things where things can go wrong. A lot of people with like an anxious attachment style can do a lot of reassurance seeking, a lot of, oh my God, did I push them away? Why are they going away? How can I fix this? What do I need to do? And then this can really overburden the other partner, because the other partner is like, why am I constantly having to give reassurance? Like, why am I hearing all these apologies? It puts me in the position of having to accept the apology or tell them that there's nothing wrong. And that's not really an attractive place to be. It also, you begin, and I've actually struggled with this in my own relationship, because, you know, Paul on this podcast has talked about, you know, how he struggles with anxiety, and I'm more avoidant and independent, and yeah, so I think, you know, oftentimes like the person with an anxious attachment style might do things like seek reassurance constantly or apologize, and the person on the receiving end of that, it might seem like, oh, it's nice, you know, like someone's apologizing to you. But if there's not anything that really happened that's bad, then that person is in a position of just constantly kind of comforting the other person and not really knowing why. And then what that, I think, can do is reverse the person who's having guilt all the time, because then, and this has happened to me, it's like, you can feel like you're a bad partner because your partner is upset or feeling guilty or asking for reassurance constantly. And so then you start feeling guilty, like, am I making my partner insecure?
Yeah.
Why are they feeling all this distress? Should I be limiting my own behavior so that they feel more comfortable? And then you start feeling guilty for seeking independence. And it's a rat's nest.
Yeah, it's a really good example of, you know, when you have no idea who's responsible for this problem and what to do to fix it, right? And in the case that you're describing, a relationship where one partner will have like anxiety, and I always like to think about it like, is this a you problem or a me problem? Like, if like Paul's upset if you're, separated or, disconnected or something, he'll be upset and you will apologize or feel bad. But it's like, where's the repair here? Like, is the repair just to apologize or to fix or him to fix? It's super confusing. I don't know. You tell me. I feel like I like getting reassurance, and I don't know how much I actually actively seek it or I subtly seek it, but I often feel guilty. I feel guilty all the time when someone feels bad, right? And this is, probably from my mom, and this probably makes me a decent therapist because I work really hard to do something about it, or have at least like a structure around it. But like, let's say I say no to somebody. If they ask me for help and I say no, or if I say something that hurts someone's feelings or I act in a way that hurts someone's feelings, I try to avoid that so much that when I do something that I could, using my therapist skills, I could think through like, is this the right thing for me? Is this, is this in line with my values and morals? And I could say yes and do it. And if I still get pushback, right, if people are upset that I didn't say yes to taking on more responsibility or upset by the things that I said, I will still feel super guilty over that. Yeah. And I seek reassurance probably from you and other people by like replaying the situation all the time. And then being like, I feel bad. Should I have said something else? Maybe I'll take it on. And often I'll either fixate on that or I'll just like go ahead and take on that extra responsibility, which ends up burning me out. Or it leads me to often like take back things that I said. Like if I said, hey, what you did hurt my feelings, and then they are upset, I go, no, it's not that bad. Never mind. Like, so my dysfunctional guilt will interferes with my relationships where it's just constantly me trying to minimize my guilt and maybe inappropriately, right?
Well, then you minimize your needs in response. Yeah. I mean, your reassurance seeking doesn't bother me because I feel like that's one way I'm actually able to be helpful to people. I have beliefs about myself that I am not helpful in 90% of cases. So
sometimes relationships are all about just finding the different pathologies we have and finding a good fit, Yeah.
No, but I see all the time how stressed out and burnt out you are. And then, you wind up getting really upset and and I think like it can lead to people taking more territory, like, I guess taking more territory in the sense of like, oh, like Kibby will say yes, Kibby will do this thing, Kibby will be helpful, and so they kind of take like more of your life over. Yeah. And then you have less and less for yourself. And then maybe they get kind of snapped at in the end because it's like, they just thought it was cool, maybe. But then other people, it feels like, are just blatantly abusing you. I shouldn't laugh at that. It's
well, I mean, this was one of my major things. My dysfunctional guilt was major things in the relationship. I mean, there's in my previous marriage where people.
That's why I was laughing.
Yeah, I mean, I was, I've gotten questions since, like, when I really described the full extent of my marriage, people were like, why did you stay in that? Why did you? And I said, maybe it's shame, but I felt a lot of guilt because we would have, this would be the cycle. He would, I don't know, not have a job. I would ask about it. He would get upset, ashamed, anxious, and then it would lead him to avoid more things. And then I was just locked in a guilt spiral of, well, I shouldn't have pushed him. I shouldn't have said anything. It probably made the situation worse. I'm probably enabling him in some way. And then so I would compensate by, just like swallowing that and just kind of pretending I didn't, just continue staying with him and not really sticking to like, no, Kibby, it is within your values to like ask about these things and to like make an equal relationship. You didn't do anything wrong. But the sight of his distress and like further dysfunction at my asking about it led me to feel guilt, which then like made me stay in it for longer and really question like my own responsibility and my own role in his stuff. and what I should do about it, which was, as you said, ignore my own needs. So here we are.
Yeah, we all have these beliefs about ourselves too. Like, I think, and I'm glad this happened in the end, but I think like when Paul and I had a really rough go in the beginning of our relationship, one of the reasons I stayed was I had this belief about myself that I didn't really love men, like other people. I shouldn't say men as if it's a sexuality thing. I didn't really like, I couldn't feel intense romantic love that would last. And that, you know, I was so hopelessly like avoidant that I would just wind up losing interest in anybody. And so I kind of like, I felt very guilty about bringing in another person into that dynamic, and then would like make myself stay. So it could be worth examining, like, what beliefs do you have about yourself that is propelling this guilt? Do you have a sense of that?
Of myself?
Of what beliefs you have about yourself, or what schemas that are causing you to like repeatedly?
Yeah, I mean, I think that my schemas are like, if I have boundaries, that's wrong, right? I should be available to everyone and be there for when they need me all the time. If someone is upset by something I did or said, it's my fault. I got to fix it, and that's wrong, right? And that comes up with me clinically, right? I'm so scared of like hurting people's feelings, or something that I probably do a little bit more supportive than maybe corrective kind of therapeutic, you know. Instead of like calling people out on their stuff, I'm more likely to overcompensate and over validate.
Yeah, I probably do that too, actually.
Yeah. But, you know, and really good therapists have, you know, my good supervisors have been like, no, sometimes people need to feel bad, and that's it's not something you did wrong, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, probably from my mother, that, you know, like causing bad feelings in other people is wrong, and I should never do it.
Yeah.
And I overcompensate, and like saying no and not doing something when I can is wrong too. So I overcompensate by doing too much. So here we are.
And didn't your father mostly give you affection and praise for like working really well, or accomplishments or something like that?
Yep. So if I didn't, that's another piece of like productivity. If I didn't work hard or anything like that, that was a problem, and I did something wrong, right? So, you know, it's just me being burnt out everywhere. But I'm learning to set limits. We can talk about treatment tips that I've received lately, that I'm trying to work on my inappropriate guilt. But
Yeah, tell us.
Okay. Awareness is number one, right? Like, you know, just actually being aware of the guilt, and being, it's just so quick for me, but just any kind of emotional awareness is helpful for everybody. And they have different tools for it. If you really don't know what emotions are happening, you do kind of a functional analysis on yourself or on the person, which is basically like looking at how that emotion plays out over time, right? So for me, the analysis would be like, oh, I said no to a person when they asked me to do more work that I literally don't have time for or don't want to do and shouldn't do because that's not my role. I said no. That person said, what? Why not? You know, and they got upset with me, right? And so actually, I usually avoid the feeling of guilt, but I would feel that pang of guilt. And then I would, in order to reduce that feeling of guilt, I just send an email right after that says, okay, fine, I'll do it. Right? So I look at my patterns over time, and this is all within seconds, right? Emails back and forth. But just getting awareness that guilt is driving that overcompensating behavior, because I've talked to you about this. I think I just did this where you and Alex and other people were like, why did you say yes? Why? And I'm like, well, I think it's guilt. So awareness is number one. And then two, this is more of the DBT strategy of trying to figure out if emotion fits the facts. So what that means is that you look at what guilt is supposed to do. Guilt is supposed to be emotion that comes up when you think you've done something wrong or something against your morals. So you ask yourself, did I do something against my morals? Did I do something that I believe is wrong? Not what someone else believes is wrong, which is the tricky part, right? But what do I believe is wrong? And if the answer is yes, I did, then it's thinking about what are the steps to actually fix it. Okay, do you need to apologize? Do you need to do something differently? Do you need to make reparations, as you said? And if it doesn't fit the facts, if I didn't do something wrong, it's opposite action. You could explain the opposite action. You know opposite action.
Oh yeah, we've talked about opposite action here before. You have to figure out, like, what does this emotion normally drive me to do? Does it drive me to say yes to things? Now you say no. Does it cause me to not point out when somebody I care about, like my partner or parent, is an asshole to me, or is kind of overstepping in my life? Like for instance, if parents won't take no for an answer, or if they, for instance, I had a friend who during the pandemic had boundaries around like whether she would be willing to spend time with her parents, and her parents just like could not take no for an answer. Holidays, they're like, you have to spend the holidays with me, and my friend was like, I'm not going to do that. I'm afraid of this disease. I'm afraid of getting you sick. So, there are just times when people will kind of overstep and they'll put their needs first, especially if you're somebody who's used to allowing them to do that, because guilt prevents you from asserting yourself. And you have to figure out, like, okay, where do I say no to people? And if I have this urge to reassurance seek, don't do that. Or perhaps instead of saying, oh my God, I just talked to my boss and I feel like it went really badly and they like looked at me like this and I'm pretty sure they hate me. Instead, maybe just objectively lay out the facts. Like, I had a conversation with my boss today. She said X, Y, and Z. I responded this way. That's what happened. And then just see if the person you're talking to even has a comment on it. Instead of saying sorry, say thank you. Oh my God, I'm so sorry I'm late. Oh, I do this every time. Instead, say thank you so much for waiting. I really appreciate that.
Yeah.
And people like being thanked much more than they like having to be in a position to forgive.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a good tip that you slipped in there, is like check to see if you tend to say sorry as a default, right? And it's when you said that, I was thinking about one of my guilt areas. It's like when someone gives me a gift or when someone does something for me, I automatically feel a ton of guilt. It's almost overwhelming to the point where that's why, when we talk about like Venmoing, I'm like, no, it's fine, I'll do it, because I just feel so much guilt when someone gives me something. And the opposite action, my supervisor told me to do this, is to say thank you and accept. And if I want to go all the way, opposite action is to ask for things.
Oh, which wow,
I do not. Yeah, that's a little too opposite that I'm not ready for. I'm taking baby steps.
Oh, Kibby, come over and talk to me when you're ready. I'm very
I'm trying to learn
asking
from you.
For things.
Yeah, I'm trying to learn from you. That's why we're a good fit, because I think, it relieves my guilt if I give you stuff and you like it. And I'm like, phew, I'm doing the right thing. So yeah, don't be like me is the tip. And also I think, a lot of these tips that we're giving, which is it's really about evaluating your own responsibility for things. Did you do something that was wrong? And also, is this something you can control? Right? Like, you might have done something wrong or something bad might have happened, but there might be nothing that you can do about it. Yeah. And actually, it sounds good to feel like I want to fix things, but if it's something that you can't actually fix, like someone's really deep mental health, right? Like you actually need a professional to help, then you really have to think about that, and also just have frank discussions with yourself or your loved ones about how much control do I have over this? Like, can I do something to change this? And the painful reality might be no. It's not about me, what I can do. Yeah,
there might be times when you have to make choices that don't ideally align with your values, but you're not 5 different people in one, So in the example I said about like the dad's in the hospital and you want to visit every day for hours and hours, but you've got kids to take care of and a job to go to, it might create a situation where, like you are doing something that leads to pain to another person, but there's just nothing you have to kind of you have to make a decision that leads to maybe everybody losing a little bit. But it's important then not to be consumed with guilt, because there's just no way to win in these scenarios. I think mindfulness can be helpful here as well. Just learning, or like a metacognitive approach of learning, okay, I'm worrying all the time, I'm feeling this intense guilt, but there's nothing I can do with this guilt. So what if I just notice it and let it pass by and focus on what's more important right now?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good one. I mean, this could be also a nice plug for family therapy or therapy for yourself, because the research, I love what you said about the attachment, about anxious attachment and how guilt plays a role in like caregiver relationships. I did read a study that showed that excessive guilt in caregivers leads to this type of emotional expression called emotional over-involvement, meaning like parents who are overly intrusive with their loved ones and their mental health struggles. So it goes both ways. The kids might feel guilt over their parents' mental health issues and vice versa. So there might they might call for some family therapy or to work through that and to really differentiate, like, we need to be individuals who have control of our own mental health, our own emotions, and with a parent and child relationship or other kind of codependent relationships, that might be really tricky. So
yeah. So how do we help friends and family? It sounded like there you were kind of giving the tip of like, parents, don't over disclose with your children.
Get therapy. I think that's the tip, is like the get therapy. Notice if you're notice the awareness part. Notice your guilt, and if you are, acting in ways out of relieving your own guilt versus like the good of your kid, the good of the other person, the good of the situation, right? If you're just trying to reduce your guilt or avoid your guilt, notice that and stop it.
Yeah, and I think friends can come in and help do a kind of an assessment of this. Like, what happened again? Okay, wait, so did this break an actual moral of yours, or are you responding to another person's distress? Like, kind of helping them figure out, is this justified guilt, or is this something else? And then, helping them act opposite to it. Like, okay, I want you to not apologize, Kibby, or not send an email saying that you'll do more, or actually set a boundary if you are, going to email, something like that. Yeah,
you could take the tip from what Jacqueline does to me all the time, where I text her frantic emails, lots of them, about did I do something wrong? I feel bad. Should I have done this? Should I have done that? And you just simply write back, do you think you did something wrong? And I said, no. She's like, well then, guilt is not appropriate. I'm like, okay.
Okay.
So, there, take the tip from Dr. Trumbull.
Dr. Trumbull, yeah.
Pre-doctor. No, PhD candidate Trumbull.
Woo!
Hey, we forgot to do the announcement of you are now a PhD candidate officially.
That's pretty exciting. I know. That I always think back to back when I was checking Reddit regularly to see what people thought of me. There was this one, they were really mad at me for before I was at Duke saying that I was a PhD student. I never said that. I would just talk about how I wanted to go in. And then that got morphed in memory to, she's saying she's a PhD candidate? She doesn't know anything that she's talking about. PhD candidates happen after you do X, Y, and Z. And like, I had never called myself a PhD candidate in my entire life, but now I am a PhD candidate, so that's just...
Yay!
I know.
Jacqueline just defended her master's thesis and crushed it, got raving reviews from everyone, so she was being too modest by leaving this at the very end. But she did super well, and now she's officially a PhD candidate and officially has her master's, so...
It's pretty cool. It's my first degree in psychology.
Master Trumbull.
Yeah. Okay, well, resources, Kibby?
I think a helpful resource, I will put up on the website the DBT handout for guilt and opposite action, so people can look at that and say, do I have a lot of this emotion? What can I do about it? And I'll also link the citations to a couple of really good papers that we read for this podcast. So.
Perfect. Well, thank you again for listening. If you have been feeling any guilt for not giving us ratings, reviews, and subscriptions, not to worry, you can always make reparations by heading over to Apple Podcasts and giving us a juicy 5-star rating. All right. We'll see you next week. By accessing this podcast, I acknowledge that the hosts of this podcast make no warranty, guarantee, or representation as to the accuracy or sufficiency of the information featured in this podcast. The information, opinions, and recommendations presented in this podcast are for general information only, and any reliance on the information provided in this podcast is done at your own risk. This podcast and any and all content or services available on or through this podcast are provided for general, non-commercial informational purposes only and do not constitute the practice of medical or any other professional judgment, advice, diagnosis, or treatment, and should not be considered or used as a substitute for the independent professional judgment, advice, diagnosis, or treatment of a duly licensed and qualified healthcare provider. In case of a medical emergency, you should immediately call 911. The hosts do not endorse, approve, recommend, or certify any information, product, process, service, or organization presented or mentioned in this podcast, and information from this podcast should not be referenced in any way to imply such approval